The ABC premiered TV's first animated primetime series, The Flintstones. In honor of the anniversary, some Flintstones trivia. It was loosely based on the Honeymooners and originally aimed at adults.
Most people think they know the Flintstones. A cartoon family living in a Stone Age suburb, driving foot-powered cars, keeping a dinosaur as a pet, yelling yabba dabba doo when the workday ends. It sounds simple enough. But underneath that cheerful prehistoric surface, the true history of this show is stranger, darker, and more fascinating than almost anyone realizes. Once you start pulling at the threads, you cannot stop. Because almost nothing about the Flintstones is exactly what it appears to be. Let us start at the very beginning, because even the name of the show almost did not happen. When William Hanna and Joseph Barbera were developing the series in the late 1950s, they called it the Flagstones. Everyone who heard it loved the name. It felt right. It had a solid, working-class ring to it. Then Mort Walker, the cartoonist who created the comic strip Blondie's Neighbors in High and Lois, noticed that his comic strip featured a family also called the Flagstones. His legal team stepped in. The name had to go. The production briefly became the Gladstones, named after a telephone exchange in Los Angeles, before finally landing on the Flintstones. Bill Hanna later said openly that losing the original name bothered him for years. He always believed the Flagstones had a better sound. The show the world came to love almost had an entirely different identity. The origin story of the show itself is equally strange. Hanna and Barbera had already won 7 Academy Awards at MGM for Tom and Jerry. Then in 1957, MGM shut down its entire animation department without warning. 2 of the most decorated animators in history were suddenly out of a job. They moved into television and built shows like Huckleberry Hound, but neither man felt satisfied. Television had turned animation into children's entertainment, and they wanted to prove they could create something for adults in prime time. The hunt for that idea became a long, messy process. The team threw around settings involving ancient Romans, pilgrims, hillbillies, and Native Americans. Nothing clicked. It was storyboard artist Dan Gordon who finally broke the deadlock with a simple suggestion: prehistoric times. He sketched 2 rough figures in animal skins, and one of them had a bird scratching a record with its beak. That single drawing gave the whole project its direction. Even after the concept came together, selling it proved nearly impossible. In early 1960, Joseph Barbera carried a 90-second pilot film and a handful of storyboards to New York and spent 8 weeks going door-to-door through network offices and advertising agencies. Day after day, executives showed almost no interest. Barbera grew exhausted and, by his own account, was nearly ready to abandon the project entirely. On the very last day of that grueling stretch, he walked into ABC and made one final pitch. That was the one that worked. The network ordered 28 episodes on the spot. The show survived by the narrowest possible margin. Now here is where things take a genuinely unsettling turn. The Flintstones was not created for children. The show premiered in September 1960 as an adult primetime comedy, and its original sponsor was Winston Cigarettes. This was not subtle background advertising. Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble appeared in fully animated segments between and during episodes where they smoked Winston cigarettes, sang the brand's jingle, and talked about how much they enjoyed the product. In one commercial, the 2 men snuck behind the house to smoke while Wilma and Betty worked inside. In another, Fred took Wilma on a date and lit her cigarette while singing the Winston theme. The very first season even embedded the Winston advertisement directly into the opening credits, though later broadcasts quietly removed it as if it had never been there. Here is the fact that tends to stop people cold. Every single one of the original voice cast members died from illnesses connected to smoking. Alan Reed, the voice of Fred Flintstone, died of emphysema and heart disease in 1977. Bea Benaderet, who voiced Betty Rubble in the early seasons, died of lung cancer in 1968 at the age of 62. Jean Vander Pyl, the voice of Wilma, died of lung cancer in 1999. Mel Blanc, who gave Barney Rubble his voice, died of emphysema and heart disease in 1989. Henry Corden, who later stepped in to replace Reed as Fred's voice, died of emphysema in 2005. Gene Vander Pyl's own son later confirmed that essentially everyone on the show smoked, and that many of the performers struggled with chronic coughing during recording sessions. He believed this was part of why both Wilma and Betty developed their distinctive closed mouth, quiet laughs. The laughter that generations of children found so charming was shaped, at least in part, by the sound of people trying not to cough. Winston ended its sponsorship in 1963 after the birth of Pebbles shifted the show's audience toward younger viewers. Welch's grape juice took over. The irony of what came next is almost too strange to believe. In 1968, just 2 years after the original series ended, Fred and Barney appeared in a public service announcement for the American Cancer Society. The same cartoon characters who had spent 2 seasons encouraging American families to smoke cigarettes were now appearing on television to warn people about cancer. The adult-oriented strangeness did not stop there. In 1967, Hanna-Barbera produced a 19-minute promotional film exclusively for distributors of Busch beer. In the film, Fred and Barney quit their jobs and spend all their time in a bar watching Busch beer commercials on a Stone Age television network. The film was never shown to the public and remains one of the most bizarre pieces of footage connected to the show. The baby Pebbles, who seems like such an innocent addition to the story, was actually the product of a completely commercial calculation. The writers originally planned for Fred and Wilma to have a son named Fred Jr., and early merchandise had already been designed around that character. Then an executive from the Ideal Toy Company pointed out that a girl doll would sell far more units than a boy doll. Joseph Barbera heard this and changed the character almost immediately. The baby became a daughter. Her name became Pebbles. What followed was one of the largest marketing campaigns television had seen at that point. A national contest asked viewers to guess Pebbles' birth weight, and more than 600,000 people sent in entries. The winner, a butcher from Florida, received a trip around the world. Newspaper advertisements for Pebbles dolls ran on the exact same day as the birth episode, with the strategy spelled out plainly: see the ad that morning, watch the episode that evening, buy the doll the next day. Within 2 months, Ideal sold 3 million Pebbles dolls and brought in the equivalent of what would be tens of millions of dollars today. The birth episode pulled ratings comparable to the famous I Love Lucy pregnancy episode from a decade earlier. And in one strange coincidence, Gene Vander Pyl, the voice of Wilma, gave birth to her own son in real life on the exact same day the episode aired. Mel Blanc, who voiced Barney and dozens of other animated characters, nearly disappeared from the show entirely in January 1961. He was driving along Sunset Boulevard when another car struck him head-on at an intersection locals called Dead Man's Curve. The crash gave him a triple skull fracture, shattered pelvis, broken ribs, fractured vertebrae in both legs, and 6 spinal fractures. He fell into a coma that lasted roughly 2 weeks. The story of how doctors at UCLA Medical Center finally reached him became famous in Hollywood. A neurologist, running out of options, tried speaking to Blanc not as a patient but as his characters. He asked Bugs Bunny how he was feeling. After a pause, from somewhere deep in the coma, Blanc answered in a weak but recognizable voice that he was just fine. He came back from one of the most catastrophic car accidents any performer had survived at that time and returned to the recording booth. Gene Vander Pyl holds a distinction that has no parallel in animated television. She voiced Wilma Flintstone in all 166 original episodes, then came back for every special, every spin-off, and every theatrical production through the 1990s. She was the only performer who appeared in the original 1959 demonstration film and was still voicing the character decades later. For that loyalty, she earned $250 per episode during the original run. When the series ended in 1966, she accepted a one-time buyout of $15,000 instead of keeping her rights to future residuals. The show then went into syndication in more than 80 countries and reached hundreds of millions of viewers over the following decades. Every time an episode aired anywhere on Earth, the money went somewhere other than the woman whose voice made Wilma who she was. She later called it the worst financial decision of her life. Then there is the matter of Fred Flintstone's gambling problem, which the show treated with a seriousness that feels completely out of place in a cartoon from 1960. An early episode reveals that Fred's childhood nickname was Betting Freddy, and that the single word bet triggers something compulsive in him. Wilma explains to another character that Fred had once gambled away everything they owned and had been ordered to see a psychiatrist because of it. The problem returns again and again across multiple seasons. Fred bets his entire weekly paycheck on dinosaur races. He loses the family's vacation fund in slot machines and then suggests selling the car so they can afford food. A gambling addiction counselor who studied the character years later concluded that Fred Flintstone displayed multiple clinical markers of a genuine gambling disorder, including an inability to stop despite consequences and a persistent pattern of chasing losses. It is a surprisingly serious thread woven through a show that most people remember as lighthearted family entertainment. The final season introduced the Great Gazoo, a tiny floating alien with a sarcastic voice who had been banished to Earth from his home planet for inventing a dangerous device. Gazoo could only be seen by Fred, Barney, children, and animals. Most fans have pointed to Gazoo's arrival in October 1965 as the moment the show lost whatever coherence it had left. His original working name was Professor O.G., from a story called The Wizard of O.G. He appeared in only 11 episodes before the series was cancelled, and his storyline about trying to return home was never resolved. He essentially vanished from the Flintstones universe for more than 30 years after the original run ended. In 2001, a special called The Flintstones on the Rocks aired once on Cartoon Network and was never broadcast again. The special showed Fred and Wilma on the verge of separating, visiting a family therapist, and struggling to hold a marriage together that had become genuinely strained. There were hints of infidelity, uncomfortable moments, and no laugh track. It carried a general audience rating, but its themes were far more adult than anything the original series had attempted. After that single broadcast, the special essentially disappeared. It has survived only through unofficial recordings passed between fans, making it one of the strangest footnotes in the show's long history. The Flintstones Children's Vitamins, which became the most successful children's vitamin brand in American history and eventually generated more than $100 million per year, had their own peculiar story. Every character from the franchise eventually appeared as a vitamin shape except Betty Rubble. The reason was not creative or deliberate. Betty's notably thin waist kept breaking during the manufacturing process, making it impossible to produce a reliable tablet. She was absent from the bottle for more than 25 years. Fans noticed. A rock band named itself Betty's Not a Vitamin in protest. Rosie O'Donnell, who played Betty in the 1994 live-action film, took up the cause publicly. Bayer eventually held a phone-in vote, and more than 15,000 people called to demand Betty's inclusion. In 1995, she finally appeared on the bottle, replacing the Flintstone car, which was discontinued. The product manager joked that he hoped nobody would be too upset about losing the car. None of these things appear in the show. There is no episode where Fred explains that his wife's vitamin shape has a structural engineering problem. There is no scene where Barney discusses the licensing agreement behind his cereal.